You really need 2 gallons of industrial-grade degreaser, Cabo Valdez? Look at you. You're asking for enough solvents to strip the paint off a Humvee just to wipe down the same linoleum. You really need 2 gallons of industrial-grade degreaser, Cabo Valdez? Look at you. You're asking for enough solvents to strip the paint off a Humvee just to wipe down the same linoleum floor you scrubbed yesterday. Some people forget that supplies cost money, and budgets matter more than the state of your petty maintenance cart. The air in the sprawling supply depot was thick with the scent of new canvas, stale lubricants, and the faint metallic tang of unissued ammunition crates stacked impossibly high toward the vaulted ceiling. Cabo Valdez stood rigidly, the handle of her worn mop acting as a nervous anchor. She wore the drab, stained utility uniform that signified her current station, barracks maintenance. Her hands, rough and permanently ingrained with the dirt of 1,000 minor repairs, gripped the wooden handle tight enough to blanch her knuckles. Sergeant Huntington, the man presiding over this bureaucratic kingdom of resources, leaned back in his chair, an expensive ergonomic model salvaged from a decommissioned HQ unit. Huntington was immaculate. His pressed uniform looked like it had been vacuum sealed onto his frame, his rank insignia gleaming under the depot fluorescence like newly minted currency. His contempt for Valdez was barely masked. It was the easy, casual superiority of a man who dealt in requisitions over risks, paper over patriotism. Sergeant, the residue from the HVAC leak near Building 4 is chemical, not standard dust, Valdez stated, her voice quiet, almost a whisper of practiced submission. Standard floor soap won't cut it. It's eating through the finish. If we don't hit it with the alkaline solvent, the whole floor needs replacement by end of quarter. Huntington sighed, a dramatic, performative exhalation that suggested Valdez had just ruined his retirement plan. He picked up a clipboard, avoiding her eyes, choosing instead to admire his own reflection in the highly polished surface of the counter. The alkaline solvent is restricted, priority 1 usage only. You want industrial-grade chemicals, you need authorization above battalion level. Do you see a battalion commander walking the decks of Barracks Maintenance 3, Cabo? No, you don't. You're the help, Valdez. Use the standard-issue dish soap and a little elbow grease, and stop trying to elevate cleaning to an operational requirement. Now move along. I have real requisitions to process. Valdez nodded once, swallowing the cold, familiar sting of the insult. The help. It was a designation she had grown accustomed to since the transfer orders came down. Orders she had initially fought, then eventually embraced as a necessary cover. She turned, the squeak of her rubber-soled boots a miserable, monotonous rhythm against the concrete floor, preparing to push her cart back toward the stifling, anonymous quiet of the barracks hallway. But the smell, a sudden, sharp whiff of solvent emanating from a freshly opened box of brake cleaner stacked nearby, caught her. It was a common scent, one of hundreds in the depot, but to her it was instant, visceral transportation. It wasn't the brake cleaner she registered. It was the ghosts the chemical odor conjured, the precise metallic smell of high explosive residue mixing with spilled diesel, and the sickly, sweet, coppery smell of blood drying too fast in the oppressive heat. Fob Chapman, August 2018. The memory hit her with the physical force of a recoil impulse, momentarily blurring the fluorescent lights into the blinding white glare of the high desert sun. She hadn't been Cabo Valdez maintenance then. She had been Specialist Valdez, attached to a highly specialized reconnaissance and counter-mobility asset. Her mission was silence, precision, and the terrifying responsibility of kinetic finality. The assignment was the high ground overlooking the main supply route, a dusty, treacherous stretch of road designated Route Tampa, known locally as the Serpent's Coil, due to the relentless IED threat. Her platform was the Barrett M107A1, the standard-issue heavy sniper rifle, chambered in the powerful .5 BMG round. It was not a weapon built for subtlety. It was built for destruction, for reaching out across impossible distances and erasing threats that conventional small arms couldn't touch. The rifle itself weighed 32 pounds unloaded, fully kitted with the massive Schmidt and Bender scope, the bipod, and a fully loaded 10-round magazine. It tipped the scales near 40. Holding that weight steady hour after hour under the brutal 120-degree sun was a physical test few could endure. Her shoulder socket still ached 5 years later, a deep, grinding reminder of the continuous, brutal kinetic energy it had absorbed. She remembered the hours of prep work leading up to the deployment. Before the first round was ever chambered, there was the math. It wasn't just basic zeroing. At the range required, well over 1,500 meters, the world started fighting back. She had meticulously calculated the precise adjustments needed for the Earth's rotation. The infinitesimal deflection known as the Coriolis effect. She had factored in the air density, the precise muzzle velocity drop across the vacuum of distance. The infinitesimal deflection known as the Coriolis effect. She had factored in the air density, the precise muzzle velocity drop across the vacuum of distance, the humidity gradient that ran between the valley floor and her elevated position, and the unpredictable, gusting side wind, known in the trade as the density-altitude correction. Every variable had to be accounted for, pre-logged into the Kestrel ballistic computer, and cross-referenced with her own internal calculations. Miss by a millimeter at the muzzle, and you missed by 10 feet at the target. There was no room for error. The lives of the convoy below depended on the certainty of her trigger finger. She had been prone for 18 hours straight, her body molded into the hard, unforgiving rock, the camouflage netting scratching her cheek. The dust, fine as flour, coated everything: her uniform, her scope, and the back of her throat. Dehydration was a constant enemy, the water in her camelback now tepid and tasting vaguely of plastic and iodine. Then, the world shattered. It started not with an explosion, but with a sudden, eerie silence over the radio network. Then, the flash. A massive IED, probably 2 repurposed 155mm artillery shells daisy-chained together, detonated under the lead MRAP, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, of the convoy. The resulting blast was immediate and catastrophic, the vehicle vaulting skyward like a twisted toy before crashing back down, engulfed in diesel fire. The silence broke into an instant, high-decibel wave of machine gun fire. The enemy had pre-sighted 2 heavy PKMs, Russian PK machine guns, on elevated positions flanking the road, designed to box the convoy in and prevent any organized retreat or counterattack. Valdez felt her adrenaline surge, not as panic, but as a cold, crystalline focus. Her eye was instantly locked into the Schmidt and Bender reticle. The magnification brought the chaos happening a mile away into terrifying, intimate detail. She saw the muzzle flash of the primary PKM, positioned high inside the ruin of an old water tower, spitting out 7.62 by 54 R rounds and continuous suppressive bursts that shredded the remaining convoy vehicles. Target 1, PKM gunner, water tower. Range, 1,678 meters. She didn't have time to re-verify the Kestrel data. She relied on muscle memory and the last sight picture she had burned into her mind. She adjusted the elevation turret by 3 clicks up, compensated 1.5 mils left for the prevailing crosswind. The heavy crosshair settled exactly 3 feet above the gunner's head, accounting for the massive parabolic arc of the .50 caliber slug over that distance. She took a slow, agonizing breath, managing the oxygen in her lungs until her heartbeat slowed to a deep, measured thud. The world narrowed to the sight picture and the resistance of the 2-stage trigger. Control the wobble, control the breath, control the impulse. She squeezed. The rifle bucked violently against her shoulder blade, the muzzle blast erupting with the sound of a small cannon, briefly blinding her in the cloud of heat and expelled gas. The sound of the shot reached the valley floor. 6 seconds later. A silent eternity passed. Through the haze of the mirage effect, she saw the PKM position go dark. The gunner, who had been an engine of relentless fire, simply crumbled, dissolving into the dust and brickwork of the tower. The massive kinetic energy of the .50 BMG round, traveling at 3 times the speed of sound, did not just kill, it disintegrated. One threat neutralized. But the situation was degrading rapidly. The second PKM opened up, immediately attempting to cover the gap left by the first. Simultaneously, she spotted a secondary threat, a 3-man squad attempting to set up a tripod-mounted RPG launcher just 800 meters from the vulnerable soft-skin supply truck stranded at the rear of the convoy. They were preparing for the final, decisive strike. Target 2, RPG team, range, 835 meters. This required a completely different calculation. The time for deliberation was gone. She ripped her eye away from the primary scope, quickly activating the secondary close-range reflex sight mounted laterally on the M107A1 rail. She swung the massive rifle, adjusting her body angle sharply, a quick, brutal movement that tore muscles in her back. The RPG team was clustered together, struggling to stabilize the weapon system. She couldn't afford to miss the launcher itself. She aimed for the center man, slightly low, trusting the concussive force and fragmentation of the massive bullet. The second shot was rushed, less pristine than the first, but equally devastating. The .50 caliber round struck the ground just shy of the team, kicking up a rooster tail of rock and debris.
but the resulting impact velocity created such a shockwave, such a localized explosion of force, that it ripped the RPG team apart. The launch tube went spinning uselessly into the sand.
For a brief, precious minute, the heavy fire ceased. The enemy was stunned, unable to locate the invisible hand striking them from the mountainside. This was the critical moment. The standard operating procedure would have been to remain hidden. For a brief, precious minute, the heavy fire ceased. The enemy was stunned, unable to locate the invisible hand striking them from the mountainside. This was the critical moment. The standard operating procedure would have been to remain hidden, conserve ammunition, and coordinate extraction for the remaining convoy elements via air support. But Valdez heard the frantic radio chatter. Two men from the lead MRAP were pinned under the wreckage, one with massive trauma, the other screaming for help, his voice cracking with fear and pain. She looked down at the Barrett. It was hot, heavy, and irreplaceable. It represented operational distance and safety. Then she looked at the wreckage, less than a mile away, but an eternity across the desert floor. I save 4 lives, or I remain hidden and safe. The decision was instant. She ripped the secondary weapon, her personal HK-416 assault rifle, from its sling, discarded the 30-plus pounds of the M107A1 onto the dusty rock face, and began her brutal descent. The drop was precarious, almost vertical in parts, forcing her to scramble down hundreds of feet of loose scree and baking treacherous stone. Her camouflage netting was torn, her uniform catching on thorns and sharp rocks. The entire tactical philosophy had shifted. She was no longer a silent reaper. She was an infantryman engaging at close quarters, moving into the kill zone she had just cleared. She reached the valley floor, sucking in air that was hot, dry, and tasted of pulverized explosives. The air was a soup of noise, the crackle of burning vehicle components, the cries of the wounded, and the unsettling whiz of sporadic small arms fire that still pinged off the stranded vehicles. She moved low, using the remaining supply truck as cover. The HK-416 felt light, responsive, a familiar extension of her own will. The weapon was zeroed perfectly for 200 meters, but here she was engaging targets often at 10 or 20 feet, a brutal, disorienting switch from kilometer precision to room-clearing intimacy. She spotted the threat she hadn't seen from above, a squad of 4 insurgents attempting to circle the crippled MRAC, finishing off the wounded. Valdez moved with a desperate, precise violence. She used a short, sharp burst to neutralize the closest two, the 5.56 rounds from the HK-416 hitting with a sharp thwack. The sound in the enclosed space was deafening, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding her night vision. The remaining 2 men reacted, spraying suppressive fire wildly toward her position. She emptied the magazine on the third man, executing a textbook transition to a fresh magazine, a fluid movement learned over thousands of repetitions, even as her heart hammered against her ribs, demanding oxygen. The fourth man turned to flee, but she managed to drop him just before he disappeared into the dense, confusing scrub. The immediate threat was gone, but the wounded were still trapped. The 2 men pinned under the twisted chassis of the MRAP were Staff Sergeant Ramos and Specialist Green. Ramos was screaming, his leg horribly broken and bleeding profusely, the bone piercing his combat boot. Green was silent, unconscious, covered in thick oil and debris, his breathing shallow and rattling. The metal was hot enough to burn skin instantly. Valdez found a piece of heavy utility bar, salvaged from the truck's debris, and began the brutal, agonizing process of prying up the edge of the heavily armored vehicle chassis. The MRAP was designed to resist explosives. It was designed to weigh 20 tons. Valdez, barely 125 pounds soaked, was fighting against physics, gravity, and adrenaline exhaustion. Her muscles screamed in protest, tearing themselves apart with the effort. Every tendon in her arms felt like it was snapping. The memory intensified, the burning metallic smell, the sheer impossibility of the lift. She managed to shift the chassis, not lift it clear, but just enough to create a gap, a sliver of space. "Sergeant Ramos, you have to move now," she yelled, her voice hoarse from the dust and terror. Ramos, despite the horrific pain, managed to drag himself out, his uniform soaked in his own blood. Green was harder. She had to crawl partially under the unstable wreck, the heat radiating off the engine blocks, searing her clothes. She secured him in a fireman's carry grip, a dead weight, and began dragging both herself and the unconscious man out from under the metallic tomb. The whole time her mind was calculating the probability of a secondary attack, checking her 6, her primary duty to get these wounded men to the relative safety of the rear supply truck. She succeeded. She got Ramos, Green, and 2 other men, a medic and a communications specialist who had been sheltering but were too stunned to act, into the relative safety of the supply truck cabin, applying tourniquets and basic field dressings with shaking hands. The air extraction finally arrived, the Black Hawk kicking up a whirlwind of dust that tasted like victory and exhaustion. Valdez was the last person to be loaded onto the helicopter, not because she was told,
but because the air extraction finally arrived, the Black Hawk kicking up a whirlwind of dust that tasted like victory and exhaustion. Valdez was the last person to be loaded onto the helicopter, not because she was told, but because she refused to move until every single living member of that convoy was safe. As the helicopter lifted off, the roar of the engines drowning out all thought, she looked back at the ravaged valley floor. She had left the Barrett M107A1 behind. It was a tactical loss, a heavy price for moving so fast, but the 4 lives she had saved were worth 10,000 rifles. She had earned the Medal of Valor for that day, a commendation that detailed the unprecedented switch from long-range precision fire to close-quarters infantry rescue, and the impossible physical exertion required to move a 20-ton wreck just enough to save 4 lives. And now, 5 years later, she was Cabo Valdez, maintenance, arguing over 2 gallons of solvent. The flash ended. The depot fluorescent lights stopped blurring. The chemical smell faded back into the background noise of the supply room. Her grip on the mop handle was so tight it was painful. She forced her shoulders to relax, forcing the elite operator back into the subservient Cabo. "Did you hear me, Valdez?" Huntington's voice cut through the silence, sharper now, laced with irritation at her momentary stillness. He took her silence as confusion or fear. "You are wasting resources. You stick to the floors, Cabo. That is your purpose. Don't try to requisition things above your pay grade or your intelligence level. Now get moving." Huntington punctuated his command with a dismissive wave of his hand. It was the movement that finally crossed the line. It wasn't the insult. Valdez could absorb the insult. It was the deliberate, casual disregard for her presence, her history, and her uniform, no matter how dirty or low-ranking. Just as Valdez prepared to offer her final, silent, miserable affirmative, the atmosphere in the supply depot changed utterly. A shadow fell across the polished counter, a deep, imposing shadow that seemed to swallow the light. Master Chief Petty Officer, MCPO, Miller, stood there. He hadn't come in through the main entrance. He seemed to have materialized from the stack of heavy-duty ordnance crates near the loading bay. Miller was Navy, clearly, specifically Special Warfare. He moved with a heavy, fluid grace that suggested every muscle fiber was tuned for catastrophic efficiency. His uniform was unremarkable, save for the distinct, quiet power he radiated. He was tall, thick through the shoulders, and his eyes, dark and unwavering, were currently fixed solely on Sergeant Huntington. In his hands, he carried his primary weapon, cradled loosely but attentively. It was not a standard-issue rifle. It was a highly customized Heckler & Koch HK416, the preferred system of elite teams. This one was adorned with proprietary optics, a specialized suppressor, and countless small personal modifications that spoke of thousands of hours spent in the field. The matte black finish of the rifle was worn smooth at the contact points, indicating deep operational use. It was a tool, yes, but also a sacred extension of the man himself. Huntington, recognizing the rank and the sheer intimidating presence of the MCPO, immediately snapped to attention, dropping his arrogant smirk. "Master Chief, didn't see you come in, sir. How can I assist Naval Special Warfare this afternoon?" Huntington stammered, scrambling to gather his paperwork into a semblance of order. His voice, moments ago booming with manufactured authority, was now thin and high. Miller didn't acknowledge Huntington directly. He kept his gaze locked on the supply sergeant, but his words were addressed to the air between them, slow and deliberate. "I was requisitioning a classified item, Sergeant, but I paused when I heard the discussion." Miller's voice was a low, gravelly baritone, the sound of command that needed no shouting to be absolute. "I heard you tell the corporal to stick to the floors. I heard you call her the help." Huntington paled instantly, realizing his casual disrespect had been broadcast to a highly decorated senior NCO from a unit whose reputation was built on ruthless efficiency and zero tolerance for internal military politics. "Master Chief, with all due respect, I was merely regulating the use of restricted high-grade alkaline solvent. It's a resource management issue, sir. The corporal is maintenance, sir. Her priority level is low." Miller slowly turned his head, his dark eyes finally resting on Valdez. Valdez, standing stiffly by her cart, met his gaze. She recognized the look. It was the look of a man who knew the cost of every second and every bullet. It was the gaze of a survivor. "Cabo Valdez,"
Miller said, the rank spoken not as a dismissal, but as a confirmation.
Did you ask for restricted solvent? Yes, Master Chief, Valdez replied, her voice remaining steady despite the sudden, intense spotlight, for chemical residue in Building 4. Miller nodded slowly, turning back to Huntington. Sergeant, show me the Priority 1 requisition form for the solvent. I want to see the criteria that place a janitorial requirement below the level of necessity. Huntington fumbled through his files, his hands visibly shaking. It's in the quarterly mandate, Master Chief. It's standard procedure. Miller waited. The silence in the depot grew cavernous. The weight of his gaze was enough to crush Huntington's composure. I don't care about standard procedure, Sergeant, Miller finally said, his tone sharpening dangerously. I care about competence, and I care about respect. He shifted his weight. His eyes returned to Valdez. There was no judgment, only a deep, penetrating curiosity. Cable Valdez? 5 years ago, August 2018, FOB Chapman. Were you attached to the 3rd Recon element providing overwatch en route Tampa? Valdez's head snapped up. Her submission instantly vanished, replaced by a deep, defensive shock. How could he possibly know? That information was buried, sealed under classification designed to protect her from attention. Yes, Master Chief, she confirmed, her voice regaining a fraction of the sharpness it once held. Miller nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his lips. He took a single, deliberate step, closing the distance between them, ignoring the terrified Sergeant Huntington entirely. I was running counterintelligence downrange that month, Cabo. I read the assessment. I read the citation for the Medal of Valor. Huntington gasped, a tiny, strangled sound of pure horror. The Medal of Valor, the 3rd highest combat decoration for bravery, was not something granted lightly. It was awarded only for heroism above and beyond the call of duty, often involving mortal risk. He had just called a Valor recipient the Help. Miller continued, his voice now a steady recitation of facts Valdez had tried desperately to forget. He was describing the action, pulling the most technical details from the citation as if reading from a ballistic chart. A single shot at 1,678 meters, a direct hit on a hostile PKM position, executed under fire, utilizing cold bore data and requiring extreme correction for atmospheric density and Coriolis drift. That's not marksmanship, Cabo. That's applied physics under extreme duress. That M107A1 you had, 32 pounds, chambered 50 BMG, you made 2 kills that saved the forward element from complete overrun. Valdez remained silent, her eyes locked on his, recognizing the validation in his tone. He wasn't praising her, he was stating the undeniable reality of her skill. But the citation doesn't stop there, does it? Miller pressed, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the listener in. It describes the moment you dropped the heavy weapon, your operational security, and switched to the HK-416, entering the kill zone to rescue 4 personnel trapped under a destroyed MRAP. He looked down at her hands, the hands currently clutching the dirty mop handle. The citation specifically notes the severe blunt force trauma to your spine and shoulders sustained while performing the physical feat of lifting, even momentarily, a partially disabled 20-ton vehicle to extract Sergeant Ramos and Specialist Green. Miller took another step, now standing directly in front of her. The contrast was stark, the impeccably clean, lethal Master Chief, and the small, dirty, exhausted corporal. You chose to save 4 lives by entering the Inferno, abandoning cover and your primary weapon. You carried a broken man, Specialist Green, unconscious, through live fire, risking total self-sacrifice. You put blood on the ground to earn that medal, Cabo. He looked over her shoulder, his eyes leveling on the quivering Sergeant Huntington. And you, Sergeant, Miller stated, his voice a flat, cold register of judgment, you refer to this corporal as the Help and deny her 2 gallons of degreaser for the mere purpose of upholding your quarterly resource mandate. Huntington opened his mouth, trying desperately to formulate an excuse or an apology, but no sound emerged. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he had insulted the wrong deity. Miller ignored the sergeant's collapse. He returned his full attention to Valdez. He reached down, gently, deliberately, and pulled the mop from her hand, setting it aside against the supply cart with a soft, final clatter. He then looked down at the HK-416 cradled in his own arms, his most prized, most trusted possession, the extension of his life and career. Every SEAL, every operator, treats their primary weapon with a level of reverence that transcends mere property. It is trust, security, and identity forged in violence. They never, under any circumstance, hand it over casually. Miller shifted the HK-416 slightly, pulling it across his chest and presenting it, muzzle pointed safely downward, directly to Valdez. The action was slow,
taking place in a thick, measured silence.
The rifle was still warm from the recent high-intensity training exercise Miller had just returned from. The scent of seal taking place in a thick, measured silence. The rifle was still warm from the recent high-intensity training exercise Miller had just returned from. The scent of CLP, cleaner, lubricant, protectant, and burnt propellant was faint but present. "Master Chief?" Valdez asked, confused by the extraordinary gesture. Miller's dark eyes held hers. "Cabo Valdez? Specialist Valdez. You carried that 40-pound weapon for days. You carried a 20-ton burden on your back. You proved your allegiance not to your rank, but to the men next to you. And you proved that you still possess the steady hand that saved those men." He paused, offering the weapon fully. "You earned this. Not the rank, but the right to touch steel. Hold this, Cabo, for 30 seconds. Valdez hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then, without fanfare, she reached out. Her hands, which moments before had been clutching the mop, shifted immediately into the practiced, ingrained configuration of a seasoned operator. Her right hand slid naturally toward the pistol grip, her index finger resting outside the trigger guard. Her left hand settled immediately and confidently on the forward rail system, gripping the cold metal precisely where the recoil absorption was most effective. The transformation was immediate and absolute. The moment her hands wrapped around the HK-416, Cabo Valdez, the janitor, vanished. Specialist Valdez, the sniper and rescuer, stood tall. Her shoulders squared, her stance widened almost imperceptibly, and her gaze, fixed on the rifle, hardened with professional familiarity. The rifle felt light, perfectly balanced, and right. It was a language she spoke fluently. Miller watched her, a look of profound, silent respect on his face. He saw the competence radiating from her, the ingrained muscle memory that no cleaning cart or bureaucrat could ever erase. Sergeant Huntington, witnessing the entire slow-motion exchange, was now visibly trembling. He wasn't just observing a show of respect, he was watching a ceremonial confirmation of absolute battlefield authority. The silent handover of a SEAL's primary weapon to a janitor was the highest possible honor, a public declaration that the recipient possessed unquestionable martial merit. "That rifle is zeroed for 300 meters, Cabo," Miller said softly. "It is maintained for absolute reliability. Your grip is perfect." Valdez slowly raised the rifle slightly, not aiming, but simply holding it in a high-ready position, checking the balance. "Thank you, Master Chief," she murmured, the weight of the rifle an affirmation of the life she had tried to leave behind. Miller didn't take the weapon back immediately. He let her hold it for the full 30 seconds, letting the silence press heavily on the supply depot. The sound of the fluorescent lights buzzing high above was the only noise. Then Miller gently reached out, resting his hand momentarily on the forearm of the HK-416, a final, shared connection. Valdez smoothly released her grip, relinquishing the weight. The weapon returned to Miller's experienced hands. Miller turned, finally addressing the supply sergeant, who looked as if he might vomit or faint. "Sergeant Huntington," Miller said, his voice flat, his gaze boring into the supply sergeant. "The corporal is requesting 2 gallons of specialized solvent. Do you or do you not have the resources to fulfill this requisition, given that the alternative is replacing an entire barracks floor due to corrosive damage?" Huntington practically leaped over the counter, scrambling to open the supply cage. "Yes, Master Chief, immediately. Cabo Valdez, please, I apologize. The alkaline solvent is yours. Take what you need. Anything. I did not check the records closely enough. My mistake, ma'am." The ma'am slipped out, a desperate recognition of rank that transcended her insignias. Valdez simply nodded, retrieving her requisition slip from the ground where it had fallen. The insult was nullified. The respect had been violently restored. She picked up her mop, which now felt impossibly light and hollow compared to the weight of the HK-416. Miller watched Valdez as she efficiently loaded the heavy containers of solvent onto her cart. He offered her a sharp, concise nod, a shared acknowledgement of the unseen history that had just played out in the mundane space of Supply Depot. "Get the job done, Cabo," Miller returned the nod, her eyes holding a faint, tired gratitude. "Always, Master Chief." She pushed the cart away, the squeak of the wheels a quiet reminder of her current duty, but the lightness in her chest an undeniable affirmation of her past. Miller turned back to the pale, shaking Sergeant Huntington. He didn't say another word about the incident. He merely stared until Huntington's eyes dropped, shame burning across his face. Miller then placed his own highly classified
Priority 1 requisition form on the counter and waited for the trembling supply sergeant to process it, a silent lesson in the profound difference between those who manage resources and those who bleed to defend them. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.